It's your boy Captain Hunter coming at you again. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Captain Hunter's podcast, the podcast that is dedicated towards bridging the divide between the police and the communities that they serve. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your love and your support. Hey, listen, do me a favor before we go on. Make sure that you hit that like and subscribe button. Make sure you smash it down a couple times. Make sure you tell your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers about what we got going on over here at Captain Hunter's podcast. I was on a little bit of a hiatus for a little bit. I had to take care of some things, went on some vacations, and just kind of made a summer extended vacation a little bit longer. And here it is, November. So I hope everybody's fall is going well so far. And I'm going to be releasing a few episodes that I had backed up or had in the can. And I'm also starting to reach out again to new prospective interviewees. So if you know anyone or have anyone that you'd like to have interviewed or think we would have a great conversation, make sure you send them over to me, cptlhunter@gmail.com, etc., and all that kind of good stuff. So, but please, in the meantime, make sure that you hit that like button, subscribe, and share these episodes. Make sure that you do that. Today, we got an episode for you today. Good episode. If you heard my episode with Tracy Harris, if you heard my episode with Ricky Green concerning why people believe false ideas and bad things and bad information and things along those lines, this is going to be the same line of people all in the same circle there. So we're going to talk about mental illness and the effects that poverty has on mental illness. Really good episode, I think, that's coming here today. So a lot of times we think that, and I don't mean to be very flippant about this, but a lot of times we think that, maybe suicide is something that happens to maybe the upper class because of, they can't deal with the stress of going to work or whatever. But there's some connections to mental illness in poverty and all that kind of thing, mental illness and poverty and affecting, suicide rates. So we're going to talk about that. So I have the Professor Rob Poole, who's on from, as you can tell by his accent, he's over there in Wales. He's over there on the other side of the pond in England. And so he's was agreed to come on the show, and we're going to talk about his work and research in Southeast Asia and the poverty that goes on there and their attempts to alleviate the problem of poverty by committing suicide. So for those of us here in America, those of us who think that these problems are, let me just start off here. Those of us who think that these are problems or issues, again, that are first world type of issues that only higher income nations may deal with these types of things, is not the case. Second problem is that mental illness strikes us all, no matter what age, race, socioeconomic background, etc. It strikes us all. And we all need to look at this and really make the proper adjustments that we can in order to help our fellow human beings out. Professor Rob Poole, I'm going to read a little bit of his biography. So he's an academic psychiatrist. He was a full-time clinician. He held posts as a consultant in Liverpool and North Wales for 21 years. He was trained at St. George Hospital in London and in Oxford. His interests center on clinical skills and issues of clinical importance that affect deprived and marginalized people. I really credit him for doing that. I think that we really have a great conversation here. And one thing that that I really wanted to get to is that he and a co-worker of his, Catherine Robinson, has been working on self-harm and suicide with colleagues in India for some years. So I think that his work with marginalized people and the suicide rates is really something for us to discuss and really for us to look at. We have a problem here within the United States that is a growing problem with our financial crisis, our economic situation, and that is homelessness. Almost all the state of California, I was on the West Coast in a couple of cities in Washington, growing problem, Seattle, all across the United States, homelessness is a problem. We're going to start seeing these problems continue to exacerbate and get worse if we don't step in and do something about these issues. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about how suicide rates affect marginalized peoples. We're going to have a great conversation. Very good. Well, thank you so much Professor Rob Poole, right? Is that how you refer to yourself as, Professor Rob Poole?
That's the convention in the UK.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on Captain Hunter's podcast. Really, really appreciate it. And really been looking forward to this conversation. I think we have a lot of interesting things to discuss. So if you would just take a moment here and just kind of introduce yourself to the audience there, please.
Okay, so I'm Rob Poole. I'm Professor of Social Psychiatry at Bangor University in North Wales. I've been a psychiatrist for a long time, 40 years this year. And I've been, for most of my career, I was a clinical psychiatrist working in central Liverpool. You probably heard of Liverpool.
Yes.
There was a beat combo in the 1960s that came from Liverpool. Liverpool was an important, or still is an important port in the UK, but has had big problems with poverty and loss of industries. So I worked in inner city areas, setting up all kinds of services, and then gradually, as I got older, moved more into academic psychiatry. So my whole career has been about the welfare of marginalized and deprived populations, first in providing services, and more recently in doing research of relevance to those groups. My current main research areas of research are I'm a leading part of something called SASHI, the South Asia Self-Harm Initiative, which is funded by the British Medical Research Council and is about setting up suicide surveillance and developing suicide prevention strategies in South Asia, which is an area with very high suicide rates. I also do work about prescribed opioids in the UK, slightly different situation in the UK to the US. And I have a range of other interests, mainly concerned with the social determinants of mental health.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. What did you always want to be a psychiatrist when you were a young guy in school, and just what made you get into this line of work?
No, I think that the first inspiration for me was Yuri Gagarin. I think I probably was interested in space ahead of everything else, and my big enthusiasm at school was actually physics. But I hit up on the idea of going to medical school, which wasn't easy. I was the first person in my family to go to university, as many of my generation were. But I eventually got a place at St George's, and it wasn't what I expected. I had some misconceptions about what medicine might be, and I think I was surprised to meet some people with what I saw as some very backward social attitudes, some people who are far from role models. I really wondered for quite a long time whether there was a place in medicine for me. And then as a medical student, I had quite a long attachment in psychiatry and thought, I can do this. This is great. And so it was a kind of like a Damascene moment. I suddenly realized that this is what I had to do with my life. And that's what I have done with my life, with no plans to pack up at the moment.
No, good.
Advancing years.
Good. So tell us a little bit about the South Asia. Yeah.
Self-Harm Initiative. Yeah. Okay. Well, just briefly, the story is that a friend of mine and a colleague who had once been someone I taught, called Murli Krishna, who had trained and worked in Liverpool and then later in North Wales with me, went back to Mysore in South India and invited me to go and speak with a colleague, at a conference that was being held in Mysore. I'm not a great traveller, actually. I've never been very interested in travelling, but I went to India to speak at the conference. And when I was there, I was asked to help give some advice about setting up a self-harm register. In other words, a register in the hospital, in medical college, the main medical college in Mysore, so that they could develop some basic surveillance of who was coming in with self-harm. Self-harm is a very, very big issue in India. The rates in South India and in Karnataka, which is the state where Mysore is, the population rate is about 5 times the UK rate. and it's a big problem, and it affects everyone. Everyone knows someone who's taken their own life. So there's been great concern about doing something about it, but they lack the kind of surveillance systems that tell you what is likely to help in preventing suicide. And we know from what research has been done previously, and there is some good quality research that's been done previously. We know that there are differences in suicide, patterns of suicide, who's affected, the kind of factors that lead people to take their own lives, and the way that people take their own lives in India and other countries, compared with the place where most of the research is done, which is the UK, the USA, Europe, Australasia, high-income countries. So basically, we did set up this self-harm register. I ended up going back, and now I've been to South India 25 or 30 times. And we began to get some research grants in to do some research on it. And then eventually we rather, as we thought, rather audaciously, made an application for quite a large amount of grant from one of our UK medical, from one of the funds run by the UK research councils. And to our delight, we got it. So we've got a collaboration. It involves partners in Pakistan, partners in India, partners in Sri Lanka. And we collaborate Bangor University, Manchester University, Oxford University, Edinburgh University, Durham University. So this is quite a large research group. Now, what we're doing with this is we're building research capacity. So we're trying to make it more possible to do sustainable research in these countries, and it isn't. They have already got a research infrastructure, but much of their research is focused on more biological aspects of mental illness, and we bring expertise with the more social aspects of mental illness, and the methods, with expertise in the methods that have not widely been used, that have been used but not widely used in those parts of the world. And it's very much about partnership. That we're not going on a kind of philanthropic basis. We're working closely with partners in each of the countries who are as equal partners, and we get something back from it, and they get something back from it. And of course, what we learn in South Asia is directly applicable to suicide prevention in the UK, partially because we've got large minority populations with South Asian heritage here, but not just because of that, because we learn other things from doing work in another, with people from another culture. So we've set up a large surveillance system, which is actually collecting data despite the current pandemic and the difficulties that has caused. We've got work synthesizing all kinds of research that's already been conducted, and understanding what the literature really existing literature tells us. We've been doing work around the media depictions of suicide, which we know has an impact ultimately on suicide rates. So, for example, if we think of a celebrity suicide in the United States, say Robin Williams, that then is followed by a bulge in suicides in the population, and that's in turn is affected by how that's reported. In particular, graphic depictions of what the person actually did are known to be associated with people following suit. So you have to be very careful with that kind of stuff. And so we're doing that kind of work in India. There's quite a lot about the stakeholders and trying to work out how to translate suicide prevention policy into action. There's a whole range of stuff we're doing out there. My part of it is very much about surveillance and collecting in a very rigorous way information about who survives suicide attempts, and to understand what can be done to prevent recurrence and to stop it happening in the first place.
Yeah, there's so much that you talked about right there. So I'll try to take it from the top here. So according to the notes that I took, you talked about the different factors. High income countries have less suicide rates than the lower lower income countries. Therefore, these are obviously, that's a determinant factor, right? The poverty rates and all that. Can you talk about a little bit about that?
Okay, so in general, in health, nearly everything that can go wrong with your body or your life has got similar social determinants. So it is, you know, if you want to be well, you really should avoid being born poor.
I hope the audience gets that. Hey, listen, just stop being born poor.
It's really not good for your health, but it isn't good for anything else either. So basically, disadvantage and inequality bear down multiply on people. So everything that can go wrong in your life tends to be associated with being at the bottom end of the pile. Now, it's in a sense that isn't surprising, but it's surprising to know that people haven't always thought that was true. There was a time in the 1950s when heart attacks were thought to be associated with executives in businesses. Well, heart attacks are much commoner in poor people. Actually, everything is commoner in poor people, and even to the point where doing something that's bad for your health is less bad for you if you've got more money. So, you know, there's cigarette for cigarette. The effect of smoking on your health is less severe if you're wealthier than if you're poorer. This is a really big effect. And as has been pointed out by important researchers in this area, like there's a very important global figure in health inequalities called Michael Marmot, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who works in London in the UK, who has pointed out that there's a gradient effect. So the effect of inequality goes all the way up to the top. So at every level, your health is worse than people higher up than you. And the more equal society is, the less health problems there are in totality. So more equal societies tend to have better health. The commonly cited example being Sweden. Now, in most countries, poverty is associated closely associated with higher suicide rates, but also living in the countryside. So this is one of the few things where it's worse for your health to be in the countryside than in the city. But suicide is one of them. So people in rural situations tend to have higher suicide rates than in urban situations. There's also a factor of culture here. So we know that some societies have higher suicide rates than others, and it isn't necessarily a simple kind of algebraic equation about how much poverty there is or how wealthy the country is. In fact, some relatively lower income countries have got better suicide rates than some higher ones. So the case in point being the USA, which has got rather a high suicide rate by the standards of most high income countries. The main factor in that is possession of firearms. So the fact that people have got the means to very reliably kill themselves around the house, it translates into higher death rates. So there's that kind of factor, and then there's more complex cultural factors. So Japan historically has had higher suicide rates than other countries. Actually, Sweden, as a very equal country, has tended to have high suicide rates. So there are other cultural factors that play against this, but it isn't fixed for all time. So to about 1990, China had suicide rates very similar to the suicide rate in India. Now that's dropped dramatically. It's really dramatically dropped. It's more than halved over the last 30 years. We're not exactly sure why, because it certainly isn't associated with a very major and concerted attempt to prevent suicide. We believe it's probably about the rate of economic development there, and it's probably related to the rate of urbanization. So as the large part of the population has moved out of the countryside and into the cities, that may have been a major factor. So it's not, these things aren't immutable, and they do change over time.
Yeah, I guess, like you said, the answer is just stop being born poor and get out of the countryside or whatever.
Well, I think there are some solutions. I think that I think there are some important solutions.
Okay.
I think one is restricting access to means of taking your life. So we know that over a wide range of measures, that if you restrict access to means, the suicide rate reduces. Now, you might think that people would simply find some other way of taking their own lives, but that isn't what happens, in fact. So catalytic converters have had an impact. The introduction of catalytic converters with less carbon monoxide in the fumes has made it more difficult to kill yourself using car fumes. So, and the suicide rate drops when you introduce catalytic converters. When in the UK, when coal gas, which also contained a lot of carbon monoxide, was phased out in place of natural gas, as it was called, the suicide rate dropped because people before that had commonly gassed themselves. So, so we do know that reducing access to means makes a difference. We know that when unemployment is high, the suicide rate goes up. And when unemployment comes down, the suicide rate goes down. Now, unemployment isn't an act of God. No. Unemployment rates can be controlled. I mean, in the USA, Roosevelt in the 1930s brought unemployment down quite sharply as an act of economic policy in the New Deal. And that kind of factor can make a big difference. So there are actually public health measures that can be taken that will reduce suicide rates. And sometimes you can see quite a sustained reduction in suicide rates. In fact, in the UK, until in 2007, we had the historically lowest rate that we'd ever had in the UK. But then we hit the financial crisis, economic times got bad, and the rate went up. So it isn't a counsel of despair at all. There are things you can do.
Well, that's at least good news. When you talked about the wealthier that people are, then the healthier that they are. I can remember just a little bit about me. My audience has probably heard this before, but I actually had a triple bypass a number of years ago, almost 3 years ago now. And so I went to the doctor, and the doctor's telling me that clogged arteries in one's heart are not the result of McDonald's, but they are the result. But people have just been struggling with this, and we don't know why for years. And then he quotes to me, a study that was done where some Egyptologists, archaeologists, whatever, had studied the remains of mummies. They did the CAT scans of mummies, and they can see the clogged arteries in their heart. Well, it turns out I actually looked up that study, and what he didn't tell me was that people who were mummified in the first place were rich people, and so it wasn't just the regular people. You had to have money in order to be mummified, and so if you had money, then you also had a different diet, and their diets consisted of animals and ducks, particularly of ducks and geese. Which are higher in fat than chicken and whatever, because that's what they float, how they float on water and all that kind of stuff. So in my mind, being wealthier, you have access to higher, more detrimental types of food, and so I'm just kind of pointing this out.
It's a very reasonable point that you raise, and diet does affect coronary artery disease, as do a number of other factors, including genetics. I mean, genetics are not irrelevant. If you've got a strong family history, you're more likely to get this problem. I'll just say about the Egyptian study. Well, there's another point about ancient Egypt, which is that if you were wealthy, you lived longer and had more opportunity to develop coronary artery disease.
Oh, well.
So if most people are kind of dying in their 30s.
Yeah,
their opportunity to develop coronary artery disease is much less. So you've got to bear in that factor in mind as well. These were probably relatively old people by the standards of ancient Egypt. Yeah. And it is true that all diseases, anyone can get them. The question is, who does get them? Who gets them most? Where are the highest prevalences? Now, there's some funny things, or not funny, but funny as in strange. So if we look at the UK, the overall level of income is higher. the effect of eating bad diets is particularly seen amongst the poorest group. We have developed an obesity problems like the US obesity problem, where obesity is.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, well, it's great. You know, well, where you go, we follow. Unfortunately, and that, of course, then means that the already high rates of coronary artery disease get higher, because you then see diabetes kicking in, and diabetes is associated with coronary artery disease. Plus, people who are poorer smoke more. Interestingly, poorer people don't drink more alcohol. At least in the UK, they don't. In the UK, poorer people tend to drink less alcohol, but there's a higher rate of very heavy drinking amongst poorer people. So if you're poor, you're more likely to be abstinent, but you're also more likely to be very heavy drinking. So overall, it's lower. But anyway, and these factors all act on each other. In countries where dietary habits change because the overall income is increasing, you see changes in heart disease patterns. But there's some things that are really strange here. So from the European and US data, you would think that diabetes was pretty much closely tied to your overall level of obesity. You know, I've lost a lot of weight during the pandemic, but I used to go to a GP and he'd say, "Well, your blood sugar is a bit high," and I say, "Well, you're telling me I'm fat." If the one goes with the other, you can tell that by looking at me. I need to lose weight. You know, you'd have to do a blood test. But actually, some interesting things are emerging in India. So in India, there's not a close association between obesity and diabetes. It's not anything like as close. So lots and lots of thin people get diabetes in India, but of course there is still an association between diabetes and being relatively poor. And so there's whatever these links are, they're not quite as mechanistic as one might think. You know, there are complex mixtures of total lifestyle, stress, different types of stress bearing down upon people.
So we talked about in the previous conversation you and I had, we talked about the biological versus the social aspect of particularly of suicide rates. And people, correct me if I'm wrong, but people back in the days, by people I mean researchers, academics back in the days, were pushing the biological aspect of it, and now it's more, and you and a number of other people are pushing the sociological aspects of this debate.
So very few suicide researchers would see suicide as predominantly a biological phenomenon, at least these days. There is a very strong, I mean, in America, USA does a very large proportion of all the research, medical research in the world, and funds an awful lot of it. And America is more than normally prone to big sweeping changes in the way they understand things. So when I was a medical student back in the 1970s, there was still a very notoriously a very strong psychoanalytic theme in American psychiatry. This all changed radically, and the milestone was really the publication of DSM-3 in 1980, and everything moved towards the biological, ending up with the 1990s being declared the decade of the brain. Huge hope that we would develop these biological treatments. Unfortunately, we haven't got new treatments. That hope was somewhat dashed. So in America, things swing backwards and forwards. In a lot of other countries, it isn't quite as dramatic as that. But certainly, in terms of suicide, there is compelling evidence that the major factors that influence suicide rates are economic, social factors rather than anything biological. Sometimes people have thought that maybe air pollution might affect rates in poor parts of the country, but it seems probably not, actually. I mean, air pollution isn't good for you. It has a health impact, but maybe not so much on your mental health. Not all suicide is related to poor mental health. So all studies show a proportion of people who take their own lives are not suffering from a mental health problem, as one would normally understand it. And in fact, in the Indian literature, it appears to be a minority of people who take their own lives are suffering from a diagnosable mental health problem. But mental health problems themselves have got important social causes. So again, in the 1980s, in fact, quite recently, people argued that the substantial causes of schizophrenia were probably genetic. Now, there is no question that there is a genetic factor in most things that happen to people, and mental illness is no different in that. But actually, there is very compelling evidence now. Some of it that has developed out of, it was being developed by actually genetic researchers, that shows that there are two big factors in the UK, just taking the UK data, that influence your chances of developing or being diagnosed with schizophrenia in adulthood. One is growing up poor in an inner city area, and it's called urbanicity. It's a major factor. The other factor is growing up Black British. That is to say, generally speaking, with parents with Caribbean heritage, because that's how ethnicity tends to run in the UK. Now, the interesting thing about that is that factor is separate from the factor about growing up in inner city areas. So you can factor those two out. They operate independently of each other. The second thing about it is that the parental generation that immigrated to the UK, so people who grew up in the Caribbean and came to the UK as adults or as young people, did not have a raised rate of schizophrenia. In fact, if anything, they had a lower rate of schizophrenia than the rest of the population in the UK. But their offspring who grow up here, which is highly suggestive, I mean, really very highly suggestive, that the key factor was growing up in a society where you faced pretty systematic obstructions to getting on, basically institutional and explicit racism. So here we have got two major social factors, growing up in an inner city area and growing up British Black, which are known to confer a considerably higher risk of developing schizophrenia or being diagnosed as having schizophrenia in adulthood. This isn't to suggest that the genetics have got nothing to do with it. And the two sets of evidence don't quite make sense together, they don't quite sit together. But that's probably about the way we understand these things interacting more than anything else. But the fact is, in terms of things that we can do to modify kids being at risk of developing psychotic illnesses as adults, then we can do something about inner city poverty, and we can do something about racism. Genetics, that might be a lot more difficult to change.
People often, at least I don't, maybe it's just my own particular circles. I mean, I would think that the racism that has existed, and let me just say that I think that the U.S. is doing a much better job today, but the racism that has existed, people have always been aware of that. But a lot of people are not aware of the racism that exists in Britain. Would you say it's just as bad, or was just as bad?
Well, of course, it has a different cultural connotation, but I think so. I mean, I was lucky. I came from a kind of left-leaning family that regarded itself as strongly anti-racist, and I was very aware that I was surrounded by people who were constantly making racist jibes, using racist words. We had awful television programs in the 1970s in this country that were frankly where the comedy was racist. It was straightforward racist. It's funny. This coming Easter weekend is the 40th anniversary of the Brixton riots, which were related to oppressive policing in Brixton, an area of London I was living very close by at the time, and I actually witnessed the first Brixton riot. And and it was awful. And the experience that black people had at the hands of the British police was absolutely awful. Now, I think as bad. Well, I'm a white guy, so I've never had an experience of racism, and I don't know of being subjected to racism, and I don't know if you can quantify the effects of growing up under racism. I also grew up with lots of images from the civil rights movement, all the stuff about the Freedom Riders and all the kind of images of lynchings, even in the 1950s, and then even more recently stuff. And, it looks very shocking and very, very violent, but it's kind of slightly alien to us. And so that may give it a twist for my not affected by racism eyes. I think if you grow up with racism, you grow up with racism. Now it's topical at the moment, isn't it? We as we speak, it's the day after the Meghan Markle interview was broadcast in the UK, and talking about racism in the royal family, which has caused quite a high degree of horror here, as I'm sure it has in the US.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with that. She did an interview, and she said that she's experiencing racism in the royal family.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I got to go watch that interview. I did not know that.
I suppose it would be a bigger deal here. Some of it's really quite. I'm no fan of the royal family, but it's pretty shocking. It's pretty shocking what she said. It's including. Well, you go see it. I mean, it's not good.
Okay, I'm going to look at it. I did not know.
It was an interview with Oprah Winfrey, so it wasn't a UK interview.
Yeah. I know that I know that they left the royal family or whatever. I don't even know what they're doing. Whatever they're doing, they're taking time off or taking a break or something like that, moving over here, and But I did not know that she was experiencing intolerance in the new family. I didn't know that.
But I think, in a broader sense, the British had the key role in slavery.
Well,
in developing a pseudoscientific concept of race and inferiority. The British Empire, which even now our government encourages us to be proud of. Well, if you spend time in countries that were British colonies, it isn't very pretty. And anyone who knows very much about the history of the British in India knows that some really, really awful things happened, including maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in the lifetime of my parents and my grandparents. There was an awful massacre of Indian civilians, unarmed Indian civilians in Amritsar in 1919. I was in India on the 70th anniversary of independence, and sat and listened to some speeches, and it made me feel quite uncomfortable about being British. People just described the manner in which the British had left and the mess they left behind. So I think the idea that the Britain is somewhere where racism plays out different. So when black US servicemen came over here during the Second World War, they were treated much better than they were used to being treated in some parts of the United States. But that doesn't mean there wasn't racism.
Yeah. I've heard that.
We're just trying to do stuff politely here,
Well, I guess that's good in a sense. You politely.
I'm not sure it is.
I mean, listen here. They were lynching us, and if they're being nice about it, Malcolm X used to say, "What in the North they were political foxes, and in the South, being the South of the United States, they were just outright wolves." So, which one? Pick your poison, kind of.
Yeah.
So yeah. What's the answer? We talked a little bit about getting rid of racism. These are really, as far as dealing with these poverty issues, right? These poverty issues are causing schizophrenia, causing suicide. We talked about getting rid of racism, doing something that we can do. We can't do anything about the genetics, as you said, but and maybe the genetics is just, maybe the poverty and other racist incidents and acts are just unlocking the genetics. However, psychology goes there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what? How do we really get rid of this? I mean, is racism going anywhere? I'd like to be optimistic, but I'm not very.
Well, I imagine, like you, I was optimistic, and I've become less optimistic. When President Obama was elected, I was astonished. I didn't think I'd see a Black American president in my lifetime, and I wrote to a friend, sent an email to a friend who's American, and said, "I'm sorry, I've underestimated Americans." And then in 2016, I thought maybe I didn't.
I was gonna say, no, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Now we've seen something very similar here. I used to say that okay, lots of things have not improved in my lifetime, but you don't hear the same degree of open racism that you used to when I was growing up. And for that matter, people's attitudes to gay people had improved as well.
Right.
Well, following Brexit, it's all come back. It was just there under the surface. It's really shocking. Close friends who have had an awful time with abuse. When are you leaving? Really. Basically, we're out of Europe now. Hadn't you better be going? And a lot worse than that. So how much progress we've made with it, I don't know. I think we don't have to completely remake the world for things to improve. Even some movement in the right direction makes a difference. I think the place that you start is around inequality. Because I think inequality is relatively easy to tackle. We have worsened inequality both in the United States and in the UK as an economic tool. We've used inequality as an economic tool. That doesn't have to be that way. It seems to me likely that in the recovery from the pandemic, governments are going to have no option but to go back to the kind of economic policies that indeed you saw under Roosevelt and we saw in the post-war period here, where rather higher rates of taxation had to be tolerated, where investment had to be made, where you economically kept unemployment under control, health improved, a whole range of social indices looked much better. I think, how do you rid the world of racism? Well, the evidence is that actually, despite everything, in the UK, particularly younger people are significantly less racist than previous generations were. And we know that in the UK, the big factor that's associated with less racism is people having black members of their family. So it's relationships that make the difference, and that's happening, and we are seeing that more and more. So even Liverpool was a very, very segregated city when I first started working there in 1988, and gradually that's changed a bit, and gradually you're seeing less racism. It hasn't gone away; it's by no means gone away, but it did improve. Or has improved. And so I think we have to hang on to the hope that we've got. I don't think we must be despairing. I think we have to bear in mind that at the end of the day, Trump was voted out.
He was.
And he was definitely voted out.
Despite what he says, he was.
And yeah, okay. So I guess we all know where the big problems are more clearly now than we did. But I think, and there's the other thing that I think that is evident is that I think white liberals have come to understand the nature of racism much better. So I think people used to take the attitude, well, you know, slavery, it was a long time ago and I wasn't there. And actually beginning to understand that that legacy is still very alive, that it's not some ancient history thing. It's actually very alive in the way the world is right now. That begins to make a difference. And I think people are beginning to understand Black perspectives better. I say, I'm not saying everything's hunky-dory. It really isn't. But I don't believe that things are completely gloomy and doom-ridden. And certainly, when I look at my kids and their friends, their attitudes are much better than some of the attitudes amongst my peer group. And I've, you know, we had family members that were racist, and I now I can honestly say I haven't got any family members that are racist. So, you know, times change.
Good, good. I've always viewed racism as a vehicle of capitalism. You talk about, you know, getting rid of inequality. What's your thoughts about that? In order to, I mean, people are capitalizing on the poor, whether it was slavery, whether it's low minimum wages. Somebody has to do this work. Somebody has to go into the mine and get the product. Somebody has to be exploited, essentially, whether it's, you know, a Walmart. I don't know if you have similar things in the UK there. You know, Walmart workers, you know, paying them minimum and low wages, and the rich get richer and the poor get poor, and they're exploiting particularly Black and brown communities.
I think that's true. I think that so I think the origin of modern racism is very much around the early stages of developing capitalism and finding very, very cheap labor. And then slavery becomes not so good as it becomes evident that if your workers aren't getting paid anything, they won't buy anything. And capitalism needs workers who can purchase as well as be exploited for their labor. But the big legacy of the British, of course, is that the way it kept people under control was divide and rule. And therefore, there's another dimension to racism that says, oh, well, we've got these kind of gradations of worth of person. And if we can split you two against each other, so, you know, the way the British managed almost everywhere they went, almost everywhere.
You got to give them credit. They were doing very good.
They were very consistent. I mean, you know, if they go to India, there are Hindu bits of India, there are Muslim bits of India. They kind of they deposed the Mughal Empire. They set up puppet regimes and set people against each other. And that's how a small number, never a massive garrison of British soldiers managed to control a huge subcontinent the size of the British Raj. They did something similar in the Middle East. It's all over the place. This is how Ireland, of course, is another example. And that then perpetuates racism, but it's just keep divisions rolling. Now, the extent to which they did that as a conscious ploy, or whether it was simply a systemic, available thing in the system that was then became prominent, I don't think makes much difference. I think that it certainly keeps people apart, and at the end of the day, interestingly, it serves the people who've got the most resources. And so then I think undoubtedly, then functionally, one cannot deny that all this racism we see here, this xenophobia, where people want people of Asian heritage to go away. They want recent European migrants to go away. At the end of the day, the people it really serves are the people who are controlling everything and hold all the money. It keeps us squabbling amongst ourselves.
I don't disagree with that at all. Do you ever bring any of your research to the public, to the government officials to say, hey, listen, here's a reason to do this because you'd be saving lives too?
Yeah, well, we do actually. And certainly politicians, of course, are not that easy to influence. And you have your most traction when there's a kind of an open door. So you may not know, we've got a semi-autonomous government in Wales. We're still part of the United Kingdom, but the health service, for example, and education are under the control of the Welsh government. And the First Minister at the moment is a guy called Mark Drakeford. So that's like, the Prime Minister, and who was previously the Minister of Health, and in a role, I had a role with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which is our national psychiatrist organisation, and that meant I used to meet with Mark Drakeford when he was Minister of Health. And Mark Drakeford is a man who understands the effects of the health, of the social determinants of health, and insofar as he has the autonomy to take action on it, does, I believe, makes efforts to act on it. So you can influence policy, but of course that doesn't apply to the Westminster government, who've got control over some very important things. So another area that I've been involved in has been about alcohol, and alcohol. We have in the UK pretty much a public health disaster around alcohol. Alcohol has got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The UK government has reduced taxation and duty on alcohol steadily for a very long time, since about 1980. And so alcohol has become relatively cheaper, and the cheaper alcohol is, the more gets consumed. And the more gets consumed, the more the population's health suffers. And it isn't just heavy drinkers whose health suffers. A wide range of people's health suffer. There's no safe limit of consuming alcohol any more than there's a safe limit for smoking cigarettes. I'm not, I take alcohol, but the fact is that the more alcohol that is consumed, the more the population's health suffers. Now we have had for some time very good evidence that if you create a minimum unit price for alcohol, then the cheapest forms of alcohol, which are consumed by the heaviest drinkers, the consumption of those drinks reduces, and using a minimum unit price for alcohol could be, for modelling exercises, could be reasonably anticipated to have a major effect on public health. Surprisingly, the Conservative government of coalition government 2010 was persuaded of this and had a policy to introduce minimum unit pricing. The alcohol industry, which is very powerful and has got powerful lobbies, persuaded the government to change its mind. But it's gone ahead in Scotland, and it's going ahead in Wales. And in Scotland, we now have effectively quasi-experimental data showing that actually introducing minimum unit pricing has exactly the effect that was modelled. It has reduced health. You present this evidence to a government that's very influenced by industrial lobbying, they know perfectly well that minimum unit pricing has an impact on public health, but they change the kind of the narrative. The narrative becomes, it's about choice. We want people to be responsible. Whereas if you really want to influence public health, you have to take public health measures, and that includes the availability of alcohol as a toxin. So sometimes you push at an open door, sometimes you think the door's open and it closes in front of you, but we move forward slowly. And the fact is, over time, you do see more public health measures introduced. The great thing that improved the health of the nation in the UK in the 19th century was sanitation, because that then rid us of epidemics of fatal illnesses that arose from consuming contaminated water. So the urban populations benefited hugely by an investment in public works. People did it, the governments did it. You could see it as philanthropic, you could see it as self-interested, because it meant that their workers were fitter and didn't go off and die. But the fact is that that's the kind of thing that makes a big difference over time, and it does happen eventually. But you just got to keep banging at the door, and that's basically what people like me do. You know, the elderly guys who've been around for years and managed to get the ear of policymakers. That's what you have to keep doing. And I'm a bore. You may have noticed yourselves, but I mean, certainly I've been going on about social determinants of mental health for some considerable time. The interesting thing is that, at least as far as my profession, it appears that people are beginning to take this on board in a much bigger way than they were previously. Not because of me in particular, but because people see the same evidence that I've seen, and become convinced that we can actually do something about this, and it's not impossible.
Well, listen, I appreciate all your work and efforts. I give you a lot of credit for your stance on racism, your stance in trying to understand the suicidal epidemic that's going on in South Asia, as well as the rest of the world there. And I appreciate that. I wish that more people thought like you and adopted your stance and had your passion for the things that you're doing. I applaud you on that. I'm going to let you go because I know that you've had a long day. It's getting late there in the UK there. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. I would just say keep up the good work. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors, and just keep going, just keep going. And I know it's got to be hard, and you're beating your head against the wall sometimes because you want the politicians to listen, and when you think they have your ear, then here comes some slick talking lobbyist and talks them out of all of these measures that we know, and I agree, would save people's lives, but that unfortunately doesn't matter as long as the bottom line is we need some more money. So it's really terrible. So,
well, thank you very much for inviting me on your podcast. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Anytime I'd like to have you back at some point. So, all right. Take care.
Bye for now.
Police reform is more than just a trending topic. My name is Lawrence Hunter. I'm a retired police captain from the state of Connecticut, and I've written a new book called Police Reform. And I talk about the evolution of law enforcement here in America and what changes need to be made in order to improve the relationship between the police and the communities that they serve. Over the past few months, it has become increasingly more important and more evident that there's something amiss and awry between the police and the communities that they serve. So whether you're about defunding the police or defending the police, if you're about Blue Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter, no matter what side of the fence you happen to sit on, make sure that you pick up your copy of Police Reform today.